The woman who rode into Caldwell, Kansas on a gray Tuesday morning in the spring of 1879 told the livery man her name was Clara Webb, and she said it the way a person says something they have rehearsed so many times it no longer sounds rehearsed at all, smooth, flat, and entirely convincing. She had been Clara Webb for 2 years and 4 months. Before that, she had been Ellen Marsh for almost a year, and before Ellen Marsh, she had been somebody else entirely, somebody with a real name, a name that belonged to a life she had fled with nothing but a carpet bag, a small revolver she barely knew how to fire, and a desperate, bone-deep need to disappear so completely that the man hunting her would eventually decide she was dead. Caldwell was a cattle town, straddling the Kansas Indian Territory border, loud and sun-baked, and full of drovers pushing longhorns north along the Kishom Trail. It was exactly the kind of place where a woman traveling alone could sink into the noise and the dust and the constant movement of strangers and not be noticed. That had been her entire strategy for 2 years: find the busiest, most anonymous corner of the frontier and press herself flat against it. She paid for a room at the Drover's Rest, a 2-story clapboard hotel that smelled of sawdust and boiled coffee, and she counted what remained of her money on the lumpy bed and found it wanting. She had enough for perhaps 3 weeks of room and board. After that, she would need work. The hotel keeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who had the look of someone who had heard every possible story and was not impressed by any of them, told her that the Copper Bell Saloon was hiring a cook's assistant, and that the schoolhouse needed a part-time teacher through the summer months while the regular teacher recovered from a broken collarbone. She also mentioned, without particular emphasis, that a ranch called the Covington, spread about 6 miles east of town, had posted a notice at the general store looking for someone to keep the books and manage correspondence, as the owner had recently lost his foreman and was drowning in paperwork. The woman who was calling herself Clara Webb thanked her and walked to the general store to read the notice herself. It was handwritten in a clear, careful hand on a piece of cream-colored paper pinned to the store's board between an advertisement for a traveling dentist and a notice about stray cattle. The writing was deliberate and unhurried, each word measured out like something the author had thought about before committing to. The notice asked for someone with arithmetic skills and legible handwriting, offered room and board on the ranch property plus fair wages, and was signed simply, A. Covington. She stood in front of that notice for a long time. Room and board meant she would not need to count her money every night. It also meant she would be 6 miles from town, which was 6 miles of open range between herself and anyone who came asking questions. It meant a degree of isolation that, after 2 years of crowded boarding houses and noisy saloons, felt like something she might actually be able to breathe inside. She took the notice down, folded it carefully, and put it in her coat pocket. The road to the Covington spread wound east through flat, rolling grassland that the spring had turned a pale, tender green. The sky above the Kansas plains was enormous, the kind of sky that made a person feel very small and, depending on who they were, either frightened or profoundly relieved by that smallness. She felt relieved. She had always felt better under open sky than under roofs. Roofs made her think of the house in Missouri, and she worked very hard not to think about the house in Missouri. She arrived at the ranch in the early afternoon. It was a working spread of real substance, a large ranch house built from limestone and timber, a proper barn, 3 outbuildings, a chicken house, a kitchen garden just beginning to show green rows, and a series of corrals where a dozen quarter horses moved in lazy circles. The whole thing had the look of a place that had been built carefully and maintained with consistent attention, not the sort of frontier operation thrown together in a season and abandoned when things got hard. A man came out of the barn as she rode up the path. He was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair pushed back under a weathered hat and the kind of face that spent most of its time outdoors, tanned, a little wind-roughened, but not unkind. He wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled up and a pair of well-worn boots that had seen a great deal of range. He was carrying a length of rope which he coiled absently as he walked toward her, and he looked at her with an expression of calm curiosity rather than the sharp, assessing wariness that many frontier men wore like armor. "Afternoon," he said. "You looking for somebody?" "I'm looking for Mr. Covington," she said. "I saw the notice at the general store." "About the bookkeeping position." He studied her for a moment without making her feel studied. "That's me," he said. "August Covington, you've got experience with accounts. I was a schoolteacher in—" She paused only for the smallest fraction of a second, the kind of pause so brief it could be mistaken for nothing at all. "In Missouri, before I came west. I taught arithmetic, composition, and Latin. I kept the records for the church fund for 3 years. I can do your books." August Covington nodded slowly, still coiling his rope. "I'm not looking for a teacher," he said. "I'm looking for someone organized enough to keep track of cattle numbers, payroll, feed costs, and contracts. It's not complicated work, but it needs to be done right and done regular, and I've been doing it myself since my foreman left, and I haven't got the hours in the day." "Then I can do that," she said. "If you'll show me your system, I'll have your records straight within a week." He looked at her for another moment, not suspicious exactly, but careful the way a man who had been disappointed before was careful. "What's your name?" he asked. "Clara Webb," she said. The name came out the way it always did. Smooth, practiced, empty. "Well, Miss Webb," he said, "why don't you come inside and I'll show you what I'm dealing with." The ranch house was as well maintained on the inside as it was on the outside, though it had the unmistakable look of a house managed by a man alone, clean enough, but without the particular arrangements and softness that a woman's presence tended to bring. There was a large stone fireplace in the main room, a long pine table that served as both dining table and work table, bookshelves along one wall with an impressive number of actual books, and in the corner, a proper roll-top desk that was currently functioning as a repository for a truly impressive accumulation of papers, receipts, tallies, bills of sale, and correspondence that appeared to have been organized by no principle she could immediately identify. August Covington gestured at the desk with a resigned sort of candor. "There it is," he said. "3 months of records since my foreman took the position up in Abilene. I've been keeping up with the cattle work and the horse work and the hiring, and the paperwork's gotten ahead of me." She stood in front of the desk and looked at the pile with the focused attention of someone who saw not a disaster but a problem with a solution. She picked up 3 papers near the top, read them quickly, set them aside in a different arrangement, and looked back at him. "I can fix this," she said. Something in his expression shifted then, not dramatically, but noticeably, the way a man's face changes when he stops bracing himself and lets himself believe something might actually go right. "I've got a small room in the house," he said. "Nothing grand, but it's private, and you'd have your meals with the household. My cook, Mrs. Beaumont, takes care of all of that. Wages are $15 a month." It was a fair offer, more than fair given that room and board came with it. She accepted without bargaining because she had learned not to seem too eager and also not to seem too knowledgeable about what things were worth, because both things attracted attention, and attention was the one thing she could not afford. Mrs. Beaumont turned out to be a broad, brown-armed woman of about 50 who had cooked for the ranch for 11 years and ran the kitchen with the serene, uncontested authority of a general who has never once doubted her own judgment. She showed Clara, the woman who was calling herself Clara, her room with brisk efficiency, told her that breakfast was at 5:30 in the morning, supper at 6 in the evening, and that she was not to leave dishes in the sink, and then went back to her kitchen with the quiet dignity of someone who had fully assessed a new arrival and provisionally approved. The room was small but real. There was a proper bed with a quilted cover, a washstand with a white basin, a window that looked east over the grassland toward a line of cottonwoods along a creek. She stood at that window in the late afternoon light and let herself, for a moment, feel something like safe. She did not trust the feeling. She had learned not to trust it, but she let herself feel it anyway, just for a moment, before she went to the desk in the main room and began methodically sorting the chaos into order. She worked until the light was gone, and Mrs. Beaumont called her firmly to supper. August Covington was already at the table when she came in, washed and changed from his work clothes into a clean shirt, though still wearing his boots and still wearing that quality of measured attentiveness that she was beginning to recognize as simply how he was rather than a specific response to her. Two ranch hands ate at the far end of the table, a young Mexican man named Tomás who had been with the ranch 4 years, and an older, angular man named Briggs who ate with the focused speed of someone who had spent most of his life never quite sure when the next meal was coming. The supper was excellent venison stew, cornbread, and early greens from the kitchen garden, followed by Mrs. Beaumont's dried apple pie, which was the best thing the woman who was calling herself Clara Webb had eaten in 2 years. "How far have you gotten?" August asked, nodding toward the main room and the desk. "I've separated everything by category," she said. "Feed receipts, cattle sales, horse sales, payroll, equipment, general correspondence. Tomorrow I'll start entering the feed receipts into your ledger chronologically and see where your current balance actually stands." He looked at her with something approaching wonder. "You did that in 4 hours. There was a system buried underneath the pile," she said. "You'd started organizing things by month, but then the month piles got mixed together. Once I sorted them back out, the structure was already there. I had a system," he said, with a self-deprecating tone that made Tomás briefly smile into his stew. "I wouldn't have called it a system, but apparently it was one." "Everything is a system," she said. "Some systems are just harder to see than others." It was the most she had said at once since arriving, and she felt Briggs's uninterested gaze on her briefly and then move away. And she felt August Covington's interested gaze on her, not moving away, but not intrusive either. Just present, the way he seemed to be present for everything fully and without apology, but without demand. She excused herself after supper and went back to the desk and worked for another hour in the lamplight before her eyes gave out and she went to bed. She slept, which was not always something she could do in a new place. Over the first week, she worked through the 3 months of accumulated records with the systematic patience of someone who genuinely loved this kind of work. The clean logic of numbers, the way a ledger told the true story of a place if you read it right, without sentiment or embellishment, just the clear arithmetic of what had come in and what had gone out and what remained. She found 2 errors in August's own rough tallies, one that had cost him and one that had accidentally favored him, and they very nearly canceled each other out. She corrected both and told him about both, which made him laugh, a short, warm sound that she noticed made the room feel slightly different. "Most folks would have just kept the one that went in their favor," he said. "I'm not most folks," she said, and then felt immediately that she had said something she hadn't intended, something too close to honest, and went back to the ledger. But he didn't press it. He thanked her and went back to his work, which was the work of the range, moving cattle, checking fences, evaluating his horses, dealing with the particular and endless problems that a working ranch generated. She learned to read his days by what he looked like when he came in at supper, the particular quality of the dust on him, whether he was moving stiffly or easily, whether the line of his jaw was tight or relaxed. She told herself she was observant by necessity, that observing people closely was how she had kept herself alive for 2 years, and that was true. But she also knew that she watched August Covington more closely than strict survival required, and she did not entirely know what to do with that knowledge. By the end of the first week, his books were in order. She presented him with a clean summary sheet showing his current financial position, his outstanding debts, the money owed to him from 3 cattle buyers who had paid on credit, and a projected feed and payroll cost for the coming quarter based on current prices at the Caldwell supply merchants. He sat at the table and read through it with the focused attention he gave everything, and she sat across from him and waited with her hands folded and her face arranged into the careful neutrality she had spent 2 years perfecting. When he finished, he set the paper down and looked at her across the table. "This is the clearest picture I've had of this ranch's finances since my father kept the books himself," he said. "He died 4 years ago. Left me the spread and a good herd and about as much paperwork as I found in that desk. I sorted it out eventually, but not like this." He paused. "You're very good at this." "Thank you," she said. "Where did you learn to think this way?" "The school teaching doesn't account for all of it." She looked at the summary sheet rather than at him. "My father was a merchant," she said, which was true, was, in fact, the most purely true thing she had said about herself since arriving. "He kept his own accounts from the time I was 8 years old, and I sat beside him while he did it. I learned the way children learn when something is done in front of them repeatedly, by absorbing it before I understood I was learning anything." "What kind of merchant?" "Dry goods," she said. "In Missouri." Missouri was safe territory. She could mention Missouri. Missouri was simply a place, a large state full of thousands of people, and mentioning it gave nothing specific away. "You're a long way from Missouri," he said, not unkindly. "Yes," she said, "I am." He looked at her for a moment with the quiet, non-demanding attentiveness that she was beginning to think was simply the way August Covington saw the world, carefully, without rushing to conclusions. Then he said, "Well, Miss Webb, I'd like to offer you a permanent position if you're willing. Same terms, but I'd also like to bring you in on the quarterly planning process. Help me project costs and timing for cattle drives, that sort of thing." She thought about the money she had been counting on the bed at the Drovers' Rest the week before. She thought about the 6 miles of open grassland between this ranch and Caldwell. She thought about the window that looked east over the cottonwoods, and the way the light came through it in the morning like something that didn't know yet that it should be afraid. "I'm willing," she said. Life on the Covington spread settled into a rhythm that felt, to the woman who was calling herself Clara Webb, dangerously like contentment. She rose early, helped Mrs. Beaumont with breakfast preparation in exchange for the older woman's patient kitchen wisdom, then spent her mornings at the roll-top desk working through whatever had accumulated correspondence from cattle buyers, invoices from the supply merchants in Caldwell, the weekly payroll calculations for the 6 ranch hands August now employed as spring work expanded. In the afternoons, she sometimes walked the property, not aimlessly but with the quiet purposefulness of someone who needed to know the shape of the ground she was standing on, and she began to know the ranch the way she had learned to know places. Thoroughly, practically, with an eye for exits and approaches and the particular rhythms of who came and went. August Covington came and went with the dependable regularity of a man whose life was governed by the needs of animals and land, rather than by preference or whim. He was up before dawn and in from the range by supper, and in between he worked with a steady, unhurried efficiency that she found herself watching with more attention than was strictly professional. He was not a man who made noise about what he did. He simply did it: fixed the fence, pulled the calf, doctored the horse, negotiated with the buyer from Wichita with the same level, undemonstrative competence he brought to everything. He was also, she discovered gradually, a man who read. The bookshelves she had noticed on her first afternoon contained real books, not just agricultural manuals and the Bible, though those were there too, but novels, history, a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman that had a cracked spine, suggesting it had been opened many times. She found this unexpectedly affecting. She did not entirely understand why, except that she had been lonely for a very long time in the particular way that an educated person is lonely when they have no one to talk to about anything that matters. And the bookshelves suggested that August Covington might be a person who understood that particular loneliness without being told about it. She did not let herself think too much about that. She could not afford to. The trouble was that he made it very difficult not to think about it. He began appearing at the desk in the evenings sometimes, not to interrupt her work, but to sit in the armchair near the fireplace with one of his books, the lamplight soft between them, the house quiet around them, and it was the most domestic, peaceful thing she had experienced in 2 years, and it made her feel like someone balanced on the edge of a cliff, aware that the view was beautiful and aware simultaneously that she could not afford to lean into it. He talked to her the way he did everything carefully, without pressure. He asked her what she thought about the contract from the buyer in Dodge City, whether the numbers looked right to her, whether she thought the price per head was fair given what she had seen of the regional market in the correspondence she processed. He asked her these things as genuine questions, not as formalities, and he listened to her answers with the focused attention of a man who actually intended to act on what she told him. And one evening in late May, he asked her if she had read Whitman, and she said yes, and they talked about Whitman for 45 minutes while the prairie darkness thickened outside the windows, and she felt herself come alive in the conversation, the way a lamp comes alive when someone touches a flame to its wick suddenly, completely, after a long time of being unlit. She caught herself just before she said something true. She excused herself early that night and lay on her bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought very seriously about leaving. She had left before. She knew exactly how to do it. Pack the carpet bag, settle the account, take the road before dawn. She had done it in circumstances that were more desperate than this and less desperate than this. The doing of it was not the problem. The problem was that she did not want to. That was new. In 2 years of running, she had never once felt the pull to stay anywhere. She had stayed places because it was practical, because she needed money, because the next move required resources she hadn't yet accumulated. Never because staying itself felt like something she wanted. She told herself it was the ranch. It was the stability, the routine, the window looking east. It was Mrs. Beaumont's dried apple pie and the satisfaction of a clean, ordered ledger and the sound of the horses moving in the corrals in the early morning. She told herself it was not August Covington. She was not very convincing. The circuit court judge came through Caldwell in the second week of June, which meant a wedding at the drover's rest between the blacksmith's son and a girl from one of the farming homesteads north of town. August rode into Caldwell for it and asked, with the careful casualness of a man who was not entirely casual about it, whether she would like to come along. Mrs. Beaumont needed supplies from the general store and would be making the trip in the wagon regardless, so the invitation was framed practically, generously, giving her a reason to accept that had nothing to do with August himself. She accepted. The wedding was a cheerful, loud affair held in the hotel's main room, crowded with drovers and merchants and homesteaders, and a handful of cowboys from the surrounding ranches who had cleaned up to a greater or lesser degree of success. The judge performed the ceremony with the practiced brevity of a man who had done it many times, and then the fiddler started, and the room reorganized itself around dancing. She had not danced in 2 years. She had been very careful not to dance, because dancing required a partner and a partner required proximity, and proximity made a person real in a way that distant acquaintance did not. Realness was dangerous. August Covington held out his hand to her anyway, and she looked at his hand for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, and then she took it, because she was tired of being afraid of things, at least for one evening. He danced the way he did everything else, competently, attentively, without showing off. He kept a proper distance and kept time with the fiddle, and did not try to use the dancing as a mechanism to say things he hadn't earned the right to say, which was more than could be said for most men at a frontier dance. She found herself, for the first time in a very long time, simply dancing, not calculating, not watching the door, just moving to the music in the lamplight with a man who held her hand like it was something worth being careful with. Between dances, they stood together at the edge of the room, and he got them both glasses of lemonade from the table along the wall, and she said, "Your ranch is mentioned in 3 of the buyer's letters I found in the desk files as a source of quality stock. That seems to be a significant part of your reputation in this market." He raised an eyebrow. "Are you talking business at a wedding dance?" She felt warmth move into her face. I know what you were doing, he said, and his tone was gentle rather than mocking. You're not the first person I've met who does that, talks about practical things when the actual subject is something harder. She looked at her lemonade. And what is the actual subject? He was quiet for a moment, looking across the room at the dancers. I don't know yet, he said honestly, but I think there is one. She did not have an answer for that. She was glad he did not press for one. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon with Mrs. Beaumont and 2 supply crates, and the kind of comfortable silence that is only possible between people who have already said something honest, even if neither of them could have told you precisely what it was. In July, a man came to the ranch. He was not anyone she knew, and he was not looking for her specifically, but he was the kind of man she had learned to read in the way frontier people learn to read weather, by the quality of the light around him, by the particular set of his body on his horse, by the way his eyes moved over a place when he arrived. He was looking for someone. He had been looking for a long time. She could see it in him the way you could see thirst. He was a hired man of some kind, not law, not exactly, but in the employ of someone who wanted something found. He spoke to August at the gate about buying a horse, which he may also have meant genuinely, and August showed him the available stock professionally and honestly, and the man eventually bought a bay gelding for a fair price and rode away east. She watched from the window of the ranch house. When August came back inside that afternoon for the payroll summary she had prepared, she was sitting at the desk with her back very straight, and her face arranged with the particular blankness she used when she was managing fear. He noticed, of course he noticed. He was the kind of man who noticed things. He set the payroll summary aside without looking at it and sat down in the armchair across from her. Something wrong? He asked. No, she said. He did not say anything. He just waited with the patient steadiness that was as much a part of him as the color of his eyes, which she had determined over the course of 2 months were a dark brown that in certain light looked almost black, and in other light had a warmth to them that was very difficult to look at directly. Who was that man? She asked after a moment. Fellow named Holt, tracking horse traders, he said. Said he had a client looking for a specific line of quarter horse stock. August paused. He did buy a good horse. Did he ask about anyone on the ranch? August looked at her steadily. He asked if I had any new employees. I told him I had hired a bookkeeper. The silence in the room was very loud. What did he say? She asked. He said his client was looking for a man, not a woman, and that wasn't his concern. August paused again. I told him you'd been here since April and that you did very good work. Something released in her chest, not entirely, but enough. Thank you, she said. Clara, he said, and the name sounded strange from his mouth in a way it never had before, a wrongness she felt but could not explain. Is there something I should know, something I can help with? Looked at her hands on the desk. The ledger was open in front of her to a page of neat columns. Numbers were easy. Numbers were honest. Numbers did not require you to be someone you weren't. No, she said, there's nothing. But she lay awake that night for a very long time, and she knew that she was lying, and she thought about what it would mean to stop. August Covington had not pressed her. That was the thing she kept returning to, the fact that he had asked, and then, when she deflected, he had let her. He had not pushed. He had not gotten that look that men sometimes got when they sensed someone was keeping a secret, the acquisitive, aggressive look of someone who believed they had a right to know. He had simply offered and then stepped back, and continued being exactly what he was: steady, warm, attentive in the way that a good person is attentive, without agenda. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about Missouri. She thought about the man she had fled, whose name was Gerald Prentice, and who was not her husband but had wanted to be, and had interpreted her refusal as a kind of theft. She thought about the night she had left, the sound she had heard through the window, the realization that had come to her in the cold clarity of genuine terror that if she did not leave that night, she would not leave at all. She thought about the money she had taken, which was her own money, her salary from the dry goods store, saved over 3 years, and how he had told people she had stolen from him and had put men to finding her and bringing her back. She thought about how she had learned in the first months that there was no avenue of formal complaint available to a woman in her circumstances, that the law as it existed in 1877 in Missouri and in Kansas and in the territories was not built with women like her in mind, and that what protection she had was the protection she could build for herself out of new names and new places and a very careful silence. She thought about her actual name, which she had not said aloud since the morning she left Missouri. She got up before dawn and went to the kitchen and made herself a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the gray pre-dawn dark and thought about all of it very carefully, the way she thought about a ledger, not with feeling at first, but with the clear arithmetic of what was real. What was real was this: Gerald Prentice was still looking. Probably. He was a persistent man with enough money to hire persistence. She had been careful, but careful was not the same as invisible, and 2.5 years was a long time to maintain a fiction without any cracks appearing. What was also real was this: she was 26 years old. She had been running since she was 23. She was tired, not weak. She was not a weak person and she knew it, but tired in the way that requires something more than sleep to fix. And August Covington was something she had not let herself hope for. She was still sitting at the kitchen table when Mrs. Beaumont came in at 5 o'clock to start breakfast, and the older woman looked at her with the particular, unsurprised understanding of a woman who has lived long enough to recognize the face of someone carrying something very heavy. "You want to talk about it?" Mrs. Beaumont asked, tying her apron. "No," she said, and then, after a moment, "Maybe, Mrs." Beaumont put the coffee pot on and sliced cornbread from the night before, and set it on a plate between them and sat down, which was unprecedented. Mrs. Beaumont did not sit at the kitchen table when there was breakfast work to be done, ever, and she said, "I've been cooking on this ranch for 11 years. I cooked for August's father, God rest him, and I've cooked for August since he was running the place alone at 28. I know that man better than most people know their own kin." She looked at the cornbread. "He's a good man," she said. It came out more nakedly than she intended. "Yes," said Mrs. Beaumont, "he is. And he's noticed you about as thoroughly as a man can notice a woman without doing anything about it, because he's also decent and he doesn't push." She poured herself a cup of coffee. "And you've been noticing him right back, which I expect you know." There was nothing useful to say to that. "Whatever you're running from," Mrs. Beaumont said, in a different, quieter tone, "I won't ask about it. Women in this country run from things plenty, and it's rarely because they've done something worth running from. It's usually because someone else has done something and there wasn't anyone to make it right." She drank her coffee. "I'm just saying that whatever your reasons, whatever's kept you wound up as tight as a new watch spring since the day you arrived, this ranch is a good place. And that man out there is worth being honest with, if you ever get to a place where you can manage it." She did not answer. But she sat with what Mrs. Beaumont had said for a long time after the older woman rose and went back to making breakfast, and she held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile, because it was either going to break her open or help her find a door. August came to her 3 days later, not in a pointed way, not with the air of a man who had decided to finally get answers. He came to the desk in the early evening when the light was long and gold through the windows, and he sat in the armchair and he said, "I want to ask you something. You can tell me it's none of my business and I'll respect that. I mean it." She set down her pen. "Go ahead," she said. "Are you in trouble?" he asked. "Real trouble, the kind that might find its way here." She was quiet for a long time. The clock on the mantel ticked through the silence with polite indifference. "I don't know," she said finally. "I've been careful, but I don't know." He nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something he had been turning over in his own mind. "The man in July," he said. "Holt. He wasn't looking for me specifically," she said, "but the person who hired him might eventually send someone who is." August looked at the fireplace, which was dark in the summer heat. Then he looked back at her. "What would you need if it came to that?" She stared at him. What would you need?" he repeated. "To be safe, to have a clear path." She did not know how to hold that question. It was not the question she had been braced for. She had been braced for him to ask what she had done, or who was after her, or what her real name was, the standard mechanics of exposure. She had not been braced for someone asking what she needed. "I don't know," she said, and her voice came out with a tremor in it that she had not authorized. "All right," he said. "That's all right. When you figure it out, I'd like to help if you'll let me." She looked at him across the quiet room in the gold evening light and felt the ground shift slightly under her, not the frightening shift of something collapsing, but the different shift of something settling, the way a foundation settles when it has fully taken weight and found it can bear it. "Why?" she asked. It came out barely above a whisper. He was quiet for a moment in his honest, unhurried way. "Because I think about you," he said simply. "More than I've thought about much of anything in a good while, and not because of the books, though the books are excellent." There was a brief, soft humor in that last line, just enough to keep the declaration from being overwhelming. "Because you're the most awake person I've ever met, and because you're clearly fighting something very hard all by yourself, and I don't think you should have to." She looked at her hands on the desk, the ledger, the careful columns. "I've been using a different name," she said. The words came out before she had made the decision to say them. "Since Missouri, this is the second name I've used." He did not flinch. He did not lean forward with that hungry look. He just waited. "I had to disappear," she said. "There was a man, not a husband, nothing like that, but someone who believed he had a claim on me that he didn't, and when I told him that, he decided I had stolen from him, which was not true, and he had resources, and I didn't, and the law wasn't going to help me, so I left. In the night. And I've been someone else ever since." "How long?" he asked. 2 years and 7 months, she said. She knew the number without thinking about it. She had been counting. He nodded. He was looking at her with an expression she could not quite name, not pity, nothing as diminishing as pity. Something more like respect, she thought, recognition. "Can I ask," he said carefully, with a gentleness that surprised her even though she was already beginning to understand that gentleness was simply what he was, "what your name actually is? Your real one?" The question landed softly, without weight, without demand. He had asked it the way you might ask a person if they would like to sit down, an offer, not an expectation. She felt something open in her chest. Not a wound, or perhaps it was, but a wound opening to clean air rather than to more damage. She took a breath. She had not said this name out loud in 2 years and 7 months. She had thought it sometimes in the very private dark, the way you think about something precious that you have had to hide somewhere safe and haven't been able to visit. She had thought it because it was still hers, even if she couldn't use it, even if she wasn't allowed to be it. "Mary," she said. Her voice was steady, to her own astonishment. "Mary Monroe." The name came out of her like something that had been held under water for a very long time and had finally broken the surface. Not gasping, the surfacing of something that had been holding its breath rather than drowning. It came out with the particular weight and clarity of something real, and the room seemed to change slightly around it, the way rooms change when something important has been said inside them. August Covington looked at Mary Monroe with the focused, warm, steady attentiveness that was his most fundamental characteristic, and he said with a quiet certainty, "Mary Monroe, that's a good name." She felt her eyes sting. She blinked. She was not going to cry in front of August Covington in the lamplight. She was not. "It's my name," she said, and it came out fiercer than she intended, and she thought he understood that too, the fierceness of someone claiming something back that was always theirs. "Yes," he said, "it is." They sat in the quiet for a moment that was different from all the previous quiet moments, weighted in a new way, richer somehow, like a chord that had been missing a note and had finally found it. "Are you going to tell me," she asked, "that I should have been honest with you from the beginning?" "No," he said. "I'm going to tell you that I think what you did took a great deal of courage, and that whatever you need to do next, you don't have to do it alone." She looked at him for a long time. "August," she said, and his name in her mouth felt like a different kind of offering than she had given anything in 2.5 years. Not a transaction, not a calculated move, not a survival mechanism. Just a name, just his name. "Mary," he said, giving hers back. She pressed her hands flat on the ledger in front of her and thought about what happened next. What happened next was practical, because she was a practical person, and because the problem that faced them was a practical one. Gerald Prentice was still out there, somewhere in Missouri or hunting along the frontier, with hired men and a story about a woman who had stolen from him, and that story needed answering or it needed ending. She explained the full situation to August over the following days, not all at once, not in a rush of confession that overwhelmed both of them, but piece by piece, the way you restore a damaged document, carefully, handling each part with attention before moving to the next. She told him about Gerald Prentice and the dry goods store, and the 3 years of wages saved in a tin box under the floorboards. She told him about the night she left, the sounds through the window, the cold particularity of true fear. She told him about the first name she had used and the boarding house in Joplin and the wagon west with a family headed for the territories who had asked no questions and to whom she would always be grateful. August listened to all of it. He asked clarifying questions sometimes, practical questions about what Prentice had told people, whether there were any documents that could establish the money as hers, whether she had any witnesses to the actual events before she left. He asked these questions with the focus of someone building something, not the focus of someone judging. On the 4th evening of this process, he said, "The circuit judge comes back through Caldwell in September. His name is Harmon Cleary and he is a fair man. I've dealt with him on land boundary questions and on a dispute with a cattle buyer, and he is fair. I think if you could make a formal statement before him about what Prentice has told people versus what actually happened, it would be a legal record that would hold against anything Prentice's hired men are carrying." She thought about this. "It would require me to use my real name," she said. "Yes," he said, "it would. And if Prentice hears that I've surfaced." "If you have a legal statement in front of a federal circuit judge," August said, "Prentice's position becomes considerably more complicated. He can't drag you back to Missouri without due process, and if his story is that you stole from him, a judge's record stating the contrary puts him in the wrong. Men like Prentice rely on their target having no recourse. Give yourself recourse and he loses his leverage." She stared at the desk. She thought about 2 years of silence, 2 years of being someone else, 2 years of counting her money on strange beds and watching every door for the wrong face. "I'd need your help," she said, "a character witness. Someone who could speak to my conduct and my honesty here." "I'll be there," he said, "and Mrs. Beaumont if she's willing, and I suspect Tamaz would go as well. You've earned a good deal of regard on this ranch, Mary." Her name in his mouth still caught her slightly every time. She was still getting used to the luxury of it. "All right," she said, "September." But July had its own complications first. A letter arrived in the 2nd week of August, addressed to the Covington ranch and carried by a boy from the Caldwell post office, who handed it to August at the gate with the indifference of someone who carries letters without reading them. August brought it in and handed it to her, because it was addressed, in a handwriting she did not recognize, to Miss Clara Webb, care of the Covington ranch. She looked at it for a moment before opening it. It was from a man named Donaldson, who identified himself as an investigative agent employed by a business interest in Kansas City language that told her exactly what it meant, which was that Gerald Prentice had upgraded from informal hired men to a formal inquiry agent, and who stated that he had reason to believe that a woman known as Clara Webb, late of Caldwell, Kansas, matched the description of a woman sought in connection with a financial matter in Missouri, and that he would like to arrange a meeting to discuss the matter at her convenience, as though she had any say in any of it. She handed the letter to August. He read it. His expression did not change significantly, but she noticed the slight tightening around his eyes that she had learned meant he was thinking through something with intensity. "He knows you're here," he said. "He knows someone called Clara Webb is here. He doesn't know I'm Mary Monroe." "Yet," August said. He set the letter down. Do you want to run? I won't stop you or blame you for it. You've gotten away before and you could do it again." She thought about it honestly for a moment. She let herself actually consider it: the carpet bag, the early morning, the road west again, another name, another place. "No," she said, "I don't want to run." Something in him relaxed very slightly. "Good," he said, "because I don't want you to run either." They agreed on a plan that was practical and direct, which suited them both. August sent a response to Donaldson's letter through the Caldwell postmaster, written in his own name, stating that Miss Webb was employed at his ranch and that any matter of a legal nature pertaining to her should be addressed through the circuit court in Caldwell, and that if Donaldson believed he had a genuine legal complaint to bring, he was welcome to bring it through proper channels when Judge Cleary convened court in September. The letter was polite, unmistakably firm, and contained August's name and standing as a property owner in Ellsworth County, Kansas, which was not nothing. It was, in the language of the frontier, a declaration that this woman had someone standing with her. She read the letter before he sent it. She read it twice. "You're making yourself a party to this," she said. "I know," he said. "It could cause you problems." "That's my concern," he said simply. "Not yours to worry about on my behalf." She wanted to say something about what that meant to her, the magnitude of it. The fact that in 2.5 years no one had stood in front of anything for her, that she had stood in front of everything herself by necessity and by will, and that the offer of someone else's shoulders to help carry it made her feel something she did not have clean words for. She wanted to say all of that. What she actually said was, "Thank you, August." He looked at her with those dark, warm eyes, and he said, "You're welcome, Mary," and he went to the Caldwell postmaster and sent the letter. Donaldson arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday morning in late August, 2 weeks before the circuit court. He was a compact, businesslike man in a town suit that was somewhat the worse for prairie travel, and he arrived with a document case and a practiced, neutral expression that told her he was professional about his unpleasant work. He introduced himself to August at the door and stated his business in formal language, and August brought him inside to the main room with the same courteous steadiness with which he handled everything. She was at the desk. She stood up when they came in, and she faced Donaldson without the blankness she normally put between herself and the world, because she had decided, sometime in the 2 weeks since his letter arrived, that she was done with blankness. Done with Clara Webb and Ellen Marsh and all the carefully maintained, exhausting emptiness of being nobody. "Mr. Donaldson," she said, "my name is Mary Monroe. I understand you've been looking for me." He looked at her with a flash of surprise he didn't quite manage to keep off his face. He had expected Clara Webb. He had not expected someone who looked him in the eye and introduced herself with her real name and a kind of calm that was clearly neither ignorance nor bravado but something more settled than either. "Miss Monroe," he said, "I represent a Mr. Gerald Prentice of Kansas City, Missouri, who alleges that I stole money from him when I left his employ," she said. "Yes. I'm familiar with the allegation. Mr. Prentice employed me as a bookkeeper at his dry goods store for 3 years. The money I took when I left was my own wages, which I had saved in my own name, and which were kept in my own secured box on property I rented from a separate landlord. Mr. Prentice has no legal claim to that money and never had. His claim is an invention designed to motivate the legal mechanisms of recovery that his money and his connections made available to him, mechanisms which were not available to me when I needed them, which is why I chose to leave rather than confront the situation directly." She paused. "I will be making a full formal statement before Judge Cleary when he convenes court in Caldwell in September. If Mr. Prentice would like to bring his legal complaint before the same judge, he is welcome to do that. I expect the outcome will not be what he anticipates." Donaldson was quiet for a moment. She could see him reassessing. He was a professional, and a professional recognized when a situation had changed from what they had been briefed about. "I was told," he said carefully, That the woman I was looking for was traveling under an assumed name and would be unlikely to. I have been traveling under an assumed name, she said. Because I had to. Because there was no other option available to me. I am done with that now. My name is Mary Monroe, and I am prepared to defend it formally in the correct legal venue. Are you? August, standing slightly behind and to the side of her, said nothing. He did not need to. His presence in the room said what it needed to say. Donaldson stayed for coffee, which Mrs. Beaumont provided with the regal indifference of someone who had seen it all, and he reviewed the documents she showed him. Her original employment agreement from the store in Missouri, the receipt from her landlord, the savings record she had maintained herself with the meticulous accuracy that was her essential nature. He could not say they were fraudulent because they were not, and a professional cannot pretend documents are fraudulent when they are clearly not. He left before noon. He did not make any promises about what he would report to Prentice, but she noted that he had photographed nothing and taken nothing, and had looked at her with an expression she read as someone reconsidering what they had been hired to recover. When his horse was out of sight down the road, she sat down heavily at the desk chair and let out a long, shaking breath. August crouched beside the chair so he was at her eye level, and he said, "Are you all right?" "I think so," she said. She looked at her hands. They were not shaking. She was genuinely surprised. That was terrifying. "You showed absolutely no sign of it. I know, I've had practice." He was quiet for a moment, close enough that she could have reached out and touched the rough fabric of his work shirt without extending her arm fully. She was aware of this in a way that was very distinct. "Mary," he said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it properly, not in the middle of a crisis, but in a quiet moment. Is this a quiet moment?" She looked at him. "I think it might be." He met her eyes with the directness that was characteristic of him, not aggressive, never aggressive, but honest in the way that a clear pane of glass is honest, letting you see straight through to what was actually there. "I've been falling in love with you," he said. "Steadily, since about 3 weeks after you arrived and fixed my books and told me both of the errors, including the one that went in my favor. I haven't said anything because you were carrying something heavy and I didn't want to add to it. But I think I'd like you to know." She looked at him for a long moment. The clock on the mantel ticked. The horses moved in the corrals outside with their usual early morning quiet. Mrs. Beaumont rattled something in the kitchen with her characteristic authority. "August," she said, and she said it with everything she meant by it, the weeks of watching him work, the evenings by the lamplight, the way he had asked her name gently and received it without flinching, the letter he had sent to Donaldson with his own name on it, all of it in one word. "Yes," he said. "I've been falling in love with you too," she said, steadily, "since about the same time, I think." He reached out and took her hand, which was on the armrest of the chair, and held it the way he had held it at the wedding dance, carefully, like something worth being careful with. And he smiled, which was something she had seen him do with measured frequency over the months of knowing him, and which she had noticed each time the way you notice something that makes the light in a room different. "Good," he said simply. "That's good." They stayed like that for a moment, her hand in his, the prairie morning light coming through the windows, and then Mrs. Beaumont called from the kitchen that dinner was in an hour and the cornbread wouldn't wait for anyone regardless of what was happening in the main room. And they both laughed, which released something that had been very tightly held. And Mary Monroe thought that this was what it felt like when something you had given up on finding was actually, finally, where you were standing. The circuit court convened in Caldwell on the 12th of September, 1879, in the back room of the general store, which was the largest enclosed space available and served multiple civic purposes. Judge Harmon Cleary was a lean, weathered man with a silver-streaked beard and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen enough of the frontier to know that most things took longer than expected, and most people were carrying more than they looked like they were carrying. Mary Monroe, who had dressed carefully for the occasion, in her best dark dress, and with her hair pinned up with the composure of someone who understood that presentation was part of argument, sat before the judge with August on one side of her, and a chair full of her own documents on the other, and she told her story. She told it clearly and completely, without embellishment and without minimizing, in the precise, measured way that her father had taught her to keep accounts. Start at the beginning, proceed in order, omit nothing relevant, add nothing that isn't. She told him about Gerald Prentice and the store and the wages and the savings and the night she left and the name she had used and why. She told him about the hired men and the letters and Donaldson's visit. She laid the documents on the table as she referenced them, each one in sequence, and the whole recitation had the clean, irrefutable logic of a well-kept ledger. Judge Cleary listened throughout without interrupting, which she took as a good sign. He asked 3 questions at the end, about the original employment terms, about the landlord's receipt, and about whether she had any witnesses to her conduct during her time in Kansas. And August answered the 3rd one, clearly and directly, with the particular authority of a man whose word in Ellsworth County carried genuine weight. The judge made his record. He stated on the record that the evidence presented supported Miss Monroe's account, and that there was no documentable basis for Mr. Prentice's allegation of theft, as it had been stated to his employed agent. He noted that a copy of his record would be filed with the federal court at Wichita and would be available to any party who wished to contest it through proper channels. Mr. Prentice, the judge said dryly, without looking up from his writing, is welcome to bring his claim before this court if he believes the documentation supports it. He will not find it to be the easy recovery he appears to have anticipated. She sat very still while the judge wrote and signed and stamped. Then it was done. She walked out of the general store into the September afternoon light with August beside her and the document, signed and sealed, in her hands, and she stood on the Caldwell boardwalk in the bright Kansas sunshine and breathed the clean, dusty air and felt something she had not felt in 2 years and 7 months and 12 days. Free. Not entirely. There would still be Prentice to consider, still the ongoing reality of a man with resources and a grudge. But free in the most essential sense, the sense that she was standing under her own name in the light of day, with a legal record behind her and someone beside her, and the combination of those things made the air taste different. August looked at her and said nothing, because he understood that this was her moment and it did not require anything from him. She looked at the document in her hands, Mary Monroe, her name, written in a judge's official hand on a formal record that would sit in a federal courthouse and say, clearly and permanently, that she was who she said she was and that she had done nothing wrong. She looked up at August. He was watching her with the warm, steady attention that had become, in the months of knowing him, the thing she sought instinctively when she needed to feel certain of something. "I think," she said, "I'd like to stop running now." "I think that's a very good idea," he said. They had supper at the hotel in Caldwell that evening, just the 2 of them, at a proper table with a white cloth, the kind of occasion that warranted the effort, which this was. They talked for 2 hours over the meal, not about Prentice or legal records or the name she had used, but about everything else, about August's father and the ranch's history, about her family in Missouri, and whether she might eventually find a way to write to her sister, who she had not contacted in almost 3 years for fear of creating a trail. About books they had both read and books they meant to read. About what kind of winter Kansas had compared to Missouri, and whether the creek along the cottonwoods flooded in the spring, and what the ranch might look like with a proper kitchen garden expansion. They talked the way people talk when they have stopped performing caution and have decided, with full consciousness, to simply be present with each other. It was the best conversation she had had in years. It was, she thought, one of the best conversations she could imagine having ever. Walking back to where the horses were stabled after the meal, in the cool, star-salted Kansas dark, he took her hand again, not like a dance partner. Just took her hand as if it were simply where his hand went, as if this were the natural order of things. She held on to it, "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask," he said. "When I said I wanted to stop running, I meant I would like to stay at the ranch, long-term, permanently if you want that." He stopped walking. She stopped with him, and they stood in the middle of the Caldwell Street in the dark with the stars enormous overhead and the distant sounds of the town at night around them, and he turned to face her. "Mary," he said, "I want that more than I want most things I can think of. But I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing, because I'm not a man who says things ambiguously, and I'd rather be very clear." He paused. "I'd like to marry you, if you'll have me. Not because of the books, and not because of the legal complexity of your situation, and not because you have nowhere else to go, because you're more capable of finding somewhere to go than most people I know, but because you're the person I want to be in the same room with for the rest of my life. Because this fall has been the best season I've had on this ranch since my father was alive. Because your name sounds like something real when I say it, and I want to keep saying it for a very long time." She looked at him in the dark, at the shape of him, at the steadiness she had come to rely on without letting herself know she was relying on it. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." He smiled, the full, unguarded version of the smile she had been collecting glimpses of for months, and it was, she thought, one of the finer sights the Kansas frontier had to offer. They were married in October, before the first frost, in a small ceremony in the Caldwell church with Judge Cleary officiating. He had come back through on his circuit and was pleased to be of service, and with Mrs. Beaumont and Tamaz and Briggs and the other ranch hands in attendance, and with the particular quality of autumn light on the plains that made everything look like it had been very deliberately arranged to be beautiful. The bride's name in the church register was Mary Monroe Covington, written in her own hand with the pen the minister provided, and she wrote it with the careful, deliberate script of a person who had spent 2 years writing names that weren't hers, and who was now, finally, writing the one that was. August stood beside her while she wrote and looked at the name over her shoulder with quiet satisfaction. The wedding supper was at the ranch, where Mrs. Beaumont had been cooking for 2 days with the focused intensity of someone who understood that the occasion warranted everything she had, and what she had was considerable. The long pine table that usually served as worktable and dining table had been extended with boards from the barn and covered with cloths and set with the ranch's mismatched best dishes, and the whole thing looked, in the October evening lamplight, like the most welcoming place Mary Monroe Covington had ever sat down to eat. Gerald Prentice did not come. Donaldson had apparently delivered a report that made the endeavor more legally complicated than expected, and the federal court record at Wichita had apparently given Prentice's lawyers sufficient pause that the active pursuit had been quietly withdrawn, not resolved, not apologized for, simply quietly dropped, which was how men like Prentice handled situations that had stopped being easily winnable. She did not trust the silence entirely, and she did not think she ever would, but silence was workable. Silence she could live with. Silence was significantly better than the alternative. She wrote to her sister in Missouri in November. She wrote carefully, not with an address at first but through a postal arrangement in Caldwell that gave her a layer of distance, and she wrote as herself, as Mary Monroe, now Mary Covington, and she told her sister as much as she could tell her, and she waited. Her sister wrote back within 3 weeks. The letter was brief and full of the kind of feeling that people put into brief letters when the actual feeling is too large for whatever space is available. And it said, among other things, that their mother was well and asked about her often, and that Prentice had told people she had gone west and was probably dead, and that the family had believed neither the story nor the death, and that they were very glad to hear from her. She sat in the main room of the ranch house on a November evening with snow beginning to fall outside the windows and read that letter 3 times. And then she cried, quietly, with the particular relief of something that has been held in a very long time finally being set down. August, coming in from the cold with snow on his hat and his shoulders, took one look at her and came to sit beside her on the settle without taking off his coat, and she showed him the letter, and he read it and put his arm around her, and she leaned into the warmth of him and the weight of his arm around her and let herself be held, which was something she had not let herself do in a very long time. Outside, the first real winter snow of 1879 came down over the Covington spread, covering the grassland and the corrals and the kitchen garden and the cottonwood line along the creek in clean white. And inside the ranch house the lamp burned warm and steady, and Mary Monroe Covington thought that this specific moment, this room, this weight against her, this letter in her hand, was the most real she had felt since the night she left Missouri. The winter settled over the ranch with the serious, committed intention of a Kansas winter, and Mary found that she loved it. She had expected to find the isolation of the ranch harder in winter, when the road to Caldwell was sometimes impassable, and the world contracted to the immediate property and the immediate people on it. But the contraction felt nothing like confinement. It felt like something she had been searching for without knowing what to call it. The house was warm and full of good work. Her books and accounts through the mornings, the long winter evenings with reading and conversation, and the fireplace lit against the dark and cold outside. August was present the way he had always been, steady, attentive, full of the particular quiet warmth that she had fallen in love with before she had let herself use the word love. Mrs. Beaumont taught her to make the dried apple pie properly, which turned out to require a technique with the pastry that was somewhat counterintuitive, and that the older woman explained with the patient authority of someone transmitting genuinely important knowledge. She wrote to her mother in December, for the first time in nearly 3 years, and the letter she wrote was the longest thing she had composed since leaving Missouri, pages and pages of the things that had happened, and the life she had now, and the man she had married and the ranch under the snow. She described the kitchen garden and the horses and the view east over the cottonwoods and Mrs. Beaumont's pie and the bookshelves, and all the small specific textures of a life that was real and hers and safe. She wrote it with the same careful attention she brought to the ledger, making sure every detail was accurate, because accuracy was how she expressed love. Her mother's reply arrived in January, and it made her laugh and cry in equal measure. And August read it at supper and laughed too, because her mother had apparently included a detailed critique of the Kansas winter climate based on an article she had read in the Kansas City newspaper. And the critique was so precise and so confident and so entirely based on no personal experience whatsoever that it was uncontestably, absolutely her mother. "I can see where you get it," August said, and she said, "Get what?" And he said, "The certainty. The organized way of looking at things," and she said, "My father was the bookkeeper, not my mother," and he said, "I don't think bookkeeping and certainty are quite the same thing," which was accurate enough that she had to concede the point. Tamaz left in the spring to take a piece of land south of the Indian Territory border, which was his ambition and had been since she had known him. August gave him a fair settlement and the bay horse he preferred, and a letter of character, and a good send-off at the supper table. Mary felt the loss of his quiet, competent presence on the ranch more than she expected to, which told her something about how thoroughly this place had become home, that the specific people in it mattered to her, that she had let them matter. They hired a new hand in the spring, a young man named Elias, 19 years old, son of a farming family from Nebraska who had come south looking for ranch work, quiet and willing to learn and useful with horses in the way that some people are useful with horses, intuitively, with a patience that couldn't be taught. He reminded her slightly of what she imagined August must have been at 19, and she found herself being kind to him with a specificity and warmth that she recognized as maternal without finding the word strange. The spring of 1880 brought new cattle from a seller in the Indian Territory, good stock, well priced, and the paperwork for the transaction was the most complex she had yet handled. involving multiple contracts and a letter of credit through the First National Bank in Wichita, which she managed with efficiency and a genuine satisfaction in the complexity of it. August reviewed her final summary of the transaction with the same attentive appreciation he always brought to her work, and he said, "My father would have liked you very much," which was the most generous thing she could think of anyone saying about another person. "Tell me about him," she said, and he did over the course of several evenings. He talked about the father who had built the ranch from a homestead claim in 1865, who had chosen limestone for the house walls because he intended to still be standing in 30 years, who had kept his own books with a system that, while not as clean as hers, had clearly been built by someone who cared about the integrity of the record. August talked about him with the particular mix of grief and pride and love that belongs to the children of people who have been genuinely good, and she listened with the full attention that was her form of devotion. She fell in love with him again, in the way that you fall in love with someone repeatedly over the course of living with them. Not the first fall, which is dramatic and strange and lit up with a kind of wild uncertainty, but the subsequent ones, which happen quietly and without announcement in the middle of ordinary things. She fell in love with the way he handled the difficult mare in the East Corral, patient and without ego, spending 3 weeks building trust from nothing. She fell in love with the way he read fully absorbed, blocking out everything around him, coming back from a book slowly, the way you come up from deep water. She fell in love with the way he argued with her about the cattle contracts when he disagreed, which was directly and honestly, and without any of the dismissive condescension that many men brought to disagreeing with women about business matters. She told him this, some of it, not all of it, because she was still and would probably always be someone who held a certain reserve of interior life, and he said, with the simple honesty that was his defining quality, "I know. I keep falling in love with you too. I expect it'll keep happening for a long time." In the summer of 1880, she told August that she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning at breakfast, with the directness that was natural to her, and the look on his face was something she wanted to put somewhere she could look at it when she needed it, complete and unguarded and lit up from inside with a joy he did not try to contain or moderate or manage. Just let be, the way he let most things be that were real and true. He stood up from the breakfast table and came around to her side and took her hands and said, "Mary," and put everything he meant into her name the way he always did, and she felt the name fill up with new meaning, as it had been doing steadily since the evening she had said it out loud in the lamplight of the ranch house for the first time in years. Mrs. Beaumont, when told, nodded with the serene satisfaction of someone who had predicted this development, and was gratified to see the world proceeding in an orderly fashion. She immediately began making adjustments to the household routine and the kitchen garden plan, and produced an opinion on the subject of the nursery that was comprehensive and entirely correct, and was acted on promptly. They wrote to Mary's mother and sister together, sitting at the long pine table one September evening with the window open to the cooling air, and the sound of the horses in the corrals, and the last light going golden over the grassland. August wrote his part, a formal, proper introduction to the family of his wife, including an account of the ranch and his circumstances that was honest and measured and rather touching in its straightforwardness. And she wrote hers, which was full of the things she had not been able to say for 3 years, and which she now had the freedom and the safety and the accumulated words to say. The letters went east on the next rider to Caldwell, and she watched the ranch road after he left with the particular feeling of someone who has sent something irreplaceable out into the world and must now simply wait. Her mother arrived in November. This was not what anyone had planned exactly, but it was entirely consistent with her mother's character, which was decisive and practical, and not especially interested in being told that something was too far or too difficult. She arrived with a carpet bag and a traveling companion, a neighbor woman named Mrs. Ott who had a daughter in Wichita and had been looking for an opportunity to travel west. And she arrived at the ranch on a gray November afternoon and stepped out of the hired wagon and looked at the limestone house and the barn and the corrals and the kitchen garden and the cottonwood line in the distance, and she said, "Well, he built something substantial. That's good." The reunion was not the weeping collapse that 2.5 years of separation might have suggested. Her mother was not a weeping woman, and Mary Monroe Covington had inherited this quality along with the bookkeeping aptitude and the organized certainty. They held each other for a long moment in the ranch yard, and Mary felt her mother's arms very tight around her and felt the shaking that her mother was very successfully suppressing. And she pressed her face into her mother's shoulder and said, for the first time since leaving, "I'm sorry." And her mother said in her ear very quietly, "You did what you had to do. Don't be sorry, just be here." August shook her mother's hand at the door and was formally and genuinely welcoming, and Mrs. Beaumont took one look at the elder Mrs. Monroe and recognized a fellow authority and extended a respect she did not extend to everyone, which was the highest form of acceptance available on the Covington spread. Her mother stayed 3 weeks. She assessed August Covington over the course of those 3 weeks with the focused attentiveness of a woman who had spent a long time worrying about her daughter, and who intended to make absolutely certain the concern was no longer warranted. She watched him work and watched him talk and watched him with Mary, and on the 4th day she found a private moment with her daughter in the kitchen and said, "He's good," in the tone of someone delivering a verdict they have considered carefully, and Mary said, "Yes, he is," and her mother nodded once and said nothing more about it because there was nothing more to say. The 3 weeks were full of the particular richness of recovered time. The conversations about the years in between, the filling in of gaps, the gradual restoration of a relationship that had been maintained at a desperate distance and was now close enough to touch. Her mother told her about the family, about her sister's new circumstances and their neighbor's farm and the changes in the town since she had left. She told her about the rumors Prentice had spread and how they had been received, and how, gradually, the community had shifted away from his version of events without anyone making a formal announcement. The natural movement of a community's opinion when a story doesn't quite fit. Prentice himself, her mother told her, had eventually moved his business interests to St. Louis. He had not made any further formal legal moves. The federal court record from Caldwell apparently sat in Wichita doing precisely what she had hoped it would do, making the cost of pursuing her greater than the satisfaction of it. She received this information in the kitchen while her mother helped her roll out pastry for a pie, a skill her mother had, which she had apparently passed to her daughter without knowing it, since Mrs. Beaumont had declared her pastry technique excellent from the first lesson, and she felt the last of the specific, coiled watchfulness that had been part of her since Missouri loosen, like a fist that has been closed so long it has forgotten how to open and then, one finger at a time, does. She was 37 weeks along when her mother left, the farewell tender and complete, and containing a promise of spring correspondence and a suggestion that Mary's sister might make the trip west in the summer. She stood in the ranch yard and watched the wagon until it was a speck on the gray road, and then she went inside to the warmth of the house and the lamp on the desk and the open ledger and the quiet December afternoon, and she sat down and felt the full weight of her life around her, the good, solid, real weight of it, and she was grateful. The baby came in December, 3 days before Christmas, in the bedroom of the limestone ranch house, while a proper snowstorm descended on the Kansas plains with the thorough commitment of a Kansas winter. Mrs. Beaumont served as midwife with the confidence of someone who had delivered multiple ranch calves and 2 previous human children and found the process comprehensible. August sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours with the concentrated stillness of a man doing the hardest kind of waiting, the kind where you cannot do anything except be ready. When Mrs. Beaumont opened the door and told him he had a son. His face did the thing that Mary had been watching for, and was glad to see the full, unguarded, open expression that came with things that were real and good and more than expected. He came in and sat beside her on the bed, and she was tired in a way that was unlike any tiredness she had experienced, deep and particular and strangely clean. And he took her hand and looked at the small, furiously existing person in the crook of her other arm, and said nothing for a long time because there was too much and words were insufficient. "Thomas," she said, eventually, "for your father." He looked at her with those dark, warm eyes, and the love in them was so plain and so complete that she thought, not for the first time, that she was going to need to get better at receiving it. It kept taking her slightly by surprise, even now, even after everything. "Thomas," he said. "Yes." Thomas August Covington came into the world in the last week of December 1880, in the middle of a blizzard, in a limestone house on the Kansas plains, and he was furious about it in the specific way of newborns who find the situation considerably less comfortable than the alternative, and he was perfect. She lay in the bedroom with the snow coming down outside the window, and the lamp burning warm on the bedside table, and August's hand over hers, and the baby making the small, enormous, specific sounds that newborns make. And she thought about the morning she had left Missouri with a carpet bag and a revolver and a terrified, determined heart. And she thought about all the roads and all the names and all the doors that had been closed or too dangerous to knock on. And she thought about the notice on the general store board in Caldwell, handwritten in a clear and careful hand, signed simply A. Covington, which she had stood in front of for a long time. She thought about the evening in the lamplight when he had asked her name gently, as if it were something she might prefer not to give, and he would respect that preference. And she thought about the way the name had come up out of her, Mary Monroe, like something that had been underwater and had finally broken the surface and found the air. She was Mary Monroe Covington. She lived on a ranch in Kansas with a man she loved completely, and a son who had his father's dark hair and her father's merchant's hands, already curled and purposeful even in sleep. And she kept the books with accuracy and care. And she grew things in the kitchen garden in the summers, and she read in the evenings, and she argued about cattle contracts, and she was learning, slowly and by careful practice, how to let herself be held. The spring of 1881 came to the plains with the particular insistence of springs that have followed hard winters, bright and almost aggressive in its greenness. The creek along the cottonwoods running high and fast with snowmelt. The kitchen garden exploding into productivity under Mrs. Beaumont's stern supervision and Mary's increasingly knowledgeable assistance. Thomas, propped against a cushion on the kitchen floor in a bar of sunlight, regarded the business of the world around him with the intent, serious interest of a person who has found everything somewhat astonishing and intends to understand it. Mary wrote letters. She wrote to her mother and her sister, regularly and with detail, and her sister wrote back with news of a planned summer visit that was confirmed by April and a source of very specific and pleasant anticipation. She wrote to the buyer in Wichita about the upcoming cattle drive and to the merchant in Caldwell about the spring supply order. She wrote, for the first time, to a women's charitable organization in Kansas City that was doing work she had read about in the newspaper, work that helped women in circumstances that required the kind of help she had once needed. And she wrote plainly about her own experience, and offered a donation from the household accounts that August endorsed without question, and with the immediate agreement of someone who understood exactly why it mattered. August's ranch expanded in the spring of 1881 with the addition of 20 acres along the creek, purchased from a homesteading family who had decided to move further west. The additional land came with a small structure that had served as a second dwelling, which they decided, after practical discussion over the supper table, to refurbish as a proper guest house against the upcoming summer visits from her family. Elias, the young ranch hand from Nebraska, proved himself fully over the winter, and was given an elevated responsibility over the horse stock, which he accepted with the seriousness of someone who understood that trust was being extended and intended to be worthy of it. He reminded her, more as the months passed, of what August must have been at that age, and she had mentioned this once, carefully, and August had looked at Elias across the yard for a moment and said, "Maybe. I hope he ends up somewhere good," and she had thought that this was the most precise and generous thing you could hope for someone. Her sister arrived in June. Her name was Anne, 2 years younger, with the same organizational nature but a different quality of energy, quicker, more outwardly expressive, inclined to declarations where Mary inclined to precision. She arrived with her own carpet bag and a thoroughgoing curiosity about the ranch and about August and about Thomas, who she declared immediately to be the finest baby she had ever seen, which Mary received with the maternal satisfaction of someone who had been privately thinking the same thing, but was glad to have it confirmed. Anne stayed 6 weeks. She rode horses for the first time in her life, with the assistance of Elias, who was patiently instructive and unfailingly courteous. And by the end of the 2nd week, she was managing a proper trot across the south pasture with a competence that surprised everyone, including herself. She helped with the kitchen garden and with the accounts, because she had inherited the same aptitude, and she engaged August in 3 separate debates about book themes that were spirited and good-natured, and that Mary watched from across the room with the private pleasure of someone whose 2 favorite people are getting along. On Anne's last evening at the ranch, they sat on the porch in the summer dark, Mary and Anne and August and Mrs. Beaumont, who had decided the occasion merited sitting, and the stars over the Kansas plain were as extreme as only Kansas stars can be, absolutely excessive in their quantity and brightness, as if the sky were trying to make a point. Anne said, looking up, "I understand why you stayed." Mary looked at her sister, and then at the dark outline of the ranch against the stars, the limestone house and the barn and the corrals and the cottonwood line along the creek, and at August beside her with his shoulder against hers and Thomas asleep upstairs in the cradle she had picked out of the supply catalog from Wichita, and she said, "Yes, I thought you might." After Anne left, the summer continued its long, bright prairie way, and the cattle drive to Abilene in late July went well, the best prices August had gotten in 3 years, and he came home from it with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose work has gone right. And Mary had the numbers ready when he arrived, the updated ledger and the projected winter financial position, and he looked at the numbers and then at her across the table and said, "How do you always have this ready exactly when I need it?" And she said, "Because I know your schedule," and he said, "Of course you do," and they ate supper together while Thomas experimented with solids in the high chair Mrs. Beaumont had produced from somewhere, with the decisive air of someone who had been waiting for the appropriate moment to deploy it. The second pregnancy came in the autumn of 1881, announced with the same morning directness as the first, received with the same full-faced joy. Mrs. Beaumont said, "Good," in the tone of someone whose predictions continue to be validated. Thomas was walking by November, not steadily, not with any significant commitment to staying upright, but with enormous ambition and an absolute refusal to be discouraged by the floor, which August found quietly hilarious, and which Mary found moving in the specific way that watching a person learn a new thing is always moving when the person has complete faith in the eventual success. The second child came in the late spring of 1882, a girl this time, born in the same bedroom in much warmer circumstances than her brother, arriving in early June while the prairie was fully committed to its best and greenest version. August was in the barn when the process began and arrived back at the house to find the situation already well underway and Mrs. Beaumont already in full authority, and he stationed himself outside the bedroom door again with the same concentrated stillness as before. He came in when Mrs. Beaumont called him, and the baby was settled against Mary's arm, and everything was the specific kind of quiet that follows something significant. And he sat beside her and looked at his daughter, who was dark-haired like her brother and her father, and who had already, in her first hour, demonstrated a quality of focused attention to the world around her that Mary recognized with a private certainty she kept to herself for the moment. "Eleanor," August said, "for my mother." She had not known that was something he wanted. She looked at him and saw that it was. "Eleanor," she said. "Yes, Eleanor Monroe Covington." He looked at her. The middle name had not been discussed. "My name," she said simply. "My actual name, it belongs in her." He held her face in his hands carefully, like the thing worth being careful with that she was, and he said, "Yes, it does." Eleanor Monroe Covington came into the world in June of 1882 on the Kansas plains, with a snowmelt creek running full along a cottonwood line, and a kitchen garden in its early summer abundance, and a brother who had already declared, in his limited but entirely decisive vocabulary, that he was not sure about the new arrival but would reserve final judgment. The limestone house on the Covington spread stood as it had always stood, built for 30 years, built to last, built with the intention of people living real lives inside it. And the life inside it was, Mary Monroe Covington thought, as real and as solid and as truly earned as anything she could have imagined standing at a window in the Drover's Rest in Caldwell counting her money on a lumpy bed in the spring of 1879. She was 29 years old. She had been Mary Monroe Covington for 3 years. She was a bookkeeper and a rancher's wife and a mother and a gardener and a reader of books and a keeper of accurate records and a woman who had walked away from one life in the dark of night and had found, through a combination of stubbornness and survival, and one carefully worded notice pinned to a general store board, another one that fit her so completely it was difficult to remember, most days, the weight of the one she had shed. August came to find her one September evening in 1882, the children both asleep upstairs, and the house quiet in its particular fall quiet, and she was at the desk, the same roll-top desk, which she had long since brought to complete and lasting order, the system now so established that maintaining it was the work of perhaps an hour a day, and he sat in the armchair across from her with his book, and neither of them spoke for a long while because nothing required saying, which was its own kind of abundance. After a while he said, without looking up from his book, "Are you happy?" She looked at him. He was looking at his page with the absorbed, slightly distant expression of a reader mid-chapter, which meant he had asked the question the way he sometimes did, casually, directly, without making it into something larger than it needed to be. "Yes," she said, "more than I thought I was going to get to be." He looked up then. He smiled, the full, unguarded version which she had now seen many hundreds of times and still found completely affecting. "Good," he said. "Me too." And he went back to his book. She went back to the ledger. Outside, the fall dark settled over the Covington spread over the limestone house, and the barn and the corrals and the kitchen garden finished for the season, and the cottonwood line along the creek that was beginning to turn gold, as it did every year, as it would every year from now forward, turning gold and then bare and then snow-covered and then green again in the steady, reliable rhythm of a place that was not going anywhere, and neither was she. Mary Monroe Covington picked up her pen and opened the ledger to the current page and began to write, in her careful and accurate hand, the accounts of a life that was fully and completely her own.